At this time, I'd like to turn things over to Chris Jonas. Please go ahead.
Good day, everyone. This is Chris Jonas. I'm the Director of Communications with the National Association for Business Economics. We're pleased to present today's webinar, which is co-hosted by the NABE Health Economics and International Roundtables. Before we turn to the topic, I just want to mention the upcoming NABE Economic Policy Conference taking place in less than 2 weeks, February 23rd to 25th at the Capitol Hilton in Washington, D.C. It's arranged around the theme 2020 Vision, examining policy prescriptions in an election year. We have quite a few keynote speakers, including Roger Ferguson, Richard Clarida, Loretta Mester, and David Malpass. Registration is available at NABE.com, and just note the advanced registration deadline is approaching. That is February 19th. So register by next Wednesday, February 19th, and save $100 off the on-site registration rate. I also wanted to draw your attention to these upcoming Certified Business Economists continuing education programs. We have a number of courses scheduled for the first half of 2020, starting with online courses in machine learning, online courses in economics and strategy and managerial decision making, and business applications of statistics and data analytics, which are starting February 18th. Then we have machine learning and data science for economists right after the policy conference. We have a number of other courses around the country later in the year, including Dallas, New York, in Canada, even in Toronto, as well as Chicago, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. So stay tuned for more CBE updates, or go to NABE.com for the latest calendar. I'd also like to point out that NABE's job board, econjobs.org, has recently relaunched with enhanced privacy controls and usability features. You can head over to econjobs.org to find your next job or to post open jobs at your firm. Okay, and now on to today's event. Just note that today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available later today on the NABE podcast page. We will have slide presentations during today's event. You can download the presenter slides in PDF format separately in the Links tab on the webinar screen. The webinar will include a question and answer period after the presentations. However, if you have a question, you can submit it any time during today's event. Just type your question into the box on the left side of the window and then click on Send. Okay, it's my pleasure now to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Jen Coriell, President of EconConcierge, Inc., and a co-chair of NABE's Health Economics Roundtable. Jen, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. We have an interesting lineup for you, starting with epidemiological perspective, and then we'll jump into the global and domestic macroeconomic impacts. And so I want to present Dr. Catherine Troisi, who is a professor at the University of Texas School of Public Health. She specializes in infectious disease epidemiology. Catherine?
Yes, thank you. There we go. Okay, what I'm going to talk to you about today is a little bit about the background of what has happened, what's the current situation as of 5 a.m. this morning, and what we can expect to see. So coronaviruses have been around for a while. They are mostly found in animals. They're RNA viruses, which means that they can change easily, so that's important to keep in mind. We know that there are 7 strains that do infect humans. 4 of these cause common colds, and in fact, there are estimates that between 10 and 30% of common colds are caused by coronaviruses. In 2002, we saw SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, show up for the first time. We were able to contain that, and we have not seen it since. In 2012, MERS-CoV, that stands for Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and the CoV is coronavirus, showed up in the Middle East, and we are still seeing cases of that. It has a high fatality rate, but does not appear to spread from human to human. The people who are getting infected have been in contact with camels. And then, as you know, last December, this new novel coronavirus, which has not been named yet. It will take a while to name it, just as a fun fact, because geographic areas do not like to have diseases named after them. So you'll see what happens with this in terms of name. So the timeline is that the cluster of cases of something that looked like flu but wasn't was seen on December 30th, 2019 in Wuhan, China. Now, there is some evidence that there were perhaps cases as early as November that were not reported. Because all of these cases had either worked or had been at the Wuhan wet market, which it's a seafood market, but also had wild exotic animals in it as well. That market was closed. Quite amazingly, in a week, the virus had been isolated, and we saw that it was a novel coronavirus that was isolated. The first fatality was reported on January 11th. On the 12th, the genome of the virus, the RNA, that is, was sequenced, again, remarkably fast. On the 13th, we saw the first case outside of China, and on the 19th, the first U.S. case in Washington, state of Washington. On the 20th, there were first reports of healthcare worker infections. This is important because they are at high risk taking care of patients, and this shows that the virus can be transmitted from person to person. On the 30th, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern, and the next day, the United States declared a public health emergency. So I'm going to tell you what we know, what we think we know, what we know right now, but it's probably going to change, and then what we don't know. So this is what we do know. This virus is a member of the coronavirus family. We haven't seen it before in humans. It's very similar to a virus found in bats, and the theory is that that's where the virus originated from, but probably came through another animal. We know that person-to-person transmission occurs. The symptoms are similar to influenza, and if you remember, this is flu season, so it can be difficult to distinguish on a clinical basis. But we are seeing that some cases may present with GI symptoms, and there also have been reports just recently that some cases do not have a fever right away, which is a little troubling because that's how we're detecting cases. We know that those who are elderly, and that means over 65, obese, those with comorbid conditions, heart disease, asthma, diabetes, kidney disease, are at higher risk of dying. So what we're pretty sure we know is that the virus is spread through droplets when people cough or sneeze, through personal contact through fomites. Those are door handles or stairway railings or things that people who have coughed into their hands touch. The virus is then on their hands. They touch the doorknob has it. You touch the doorknob. Then you rub your eyes, you touch your nose, and you transmit the virus to yourself. There was a report yesterday that the virus may be able to be spread by saliva, urine, and feces. But this might change. The incubation period, that is from the time that you've been exposed to the virus to the time that you show symptoms, seems to vary between 1 and 14 days, although the mean is around 5 days. We think we know, we're pretty sure, that this virus is more infectious than SARS, but doesn't kill as high a percent of people as SARS did. As we saw with SARS, there appear to be super spreaders, that is, people who are extremely efficient at infecting other people. So what we're observed now that will probably change is that about 15 to 20% of infections are severe. Now, the reason that's going to change is right now we're only looking at people who are sick, and we don't know the bottom of the iceberg, how many people just have mild disease or maybe no symptoms at all but still have the virus. About 2% of those who are infected die. Again, that number is most likely going to go down, probably dramatically, and are not, which is a measure of how easily the virus spreads. This is for every infected person, how many people do they infect? is between 1.5 and 3.5. So comparing that to other diseases, Ebola is 2, HIV and SARS about 4, flu is 1.5 to 1.2 to 1.5. So it's right in the lower range there. Measles, on the other hand, is between 15 and 18. So what don't we know? There's a lot we don't know. This is very early in the epidemic, and it's going to take time to find out some of these things. As you know, countries are trying mass-scale quarantines, particularly China, and we just don't know how effective those are going to be. People were infected before the quarantines were put in place, and there's a lot of downsides to quarantines. We don't know if there are some genetic differences between people in who's more likely to get infected and who is more likely to die. We don't know how long it takes on average to recover from the infection. As I mentioned, we don't know the role of people who either have asymptomatic, that is no symptoms, or very mild symptoms. Can they transmit the virus? There has been a report that people can transmit the virus before they have symptoms. That was retracted, and now it's back. It's just unclear whether that's true. It was not true with SARS. We don't know when a person is most infectious. Is it right when they first become ill, or is it later in the disease? With SARS, it was about 5 days after symptoms occurred, and this has some consequences for who you're going to infect. We don't know where in the body the virus replicates, and we don't know best clinical management of cases. Right now, it's just supportive care. So, as of 5:30 a.m. this morning, there were 43,138 confirmed infections. 99% of those were inside, mainly in China, fewer than 500 outside of China. Now, that number is undoubtedly an undercount because not everybody's getting tested. And again, only the people with symptoms, and particularly severe symptoms, are being tested. There have been over 1,000 deaths, which is more than SARS. However, only 2 deaths have occurred outside of China. There are cases of this 2019 novel coronavirus in 27 other countries, but the vast majority of cases have been linked to travel. That is, they were exposed in China. However, 11 countries have reported that someone who got infected in China came back to their home country and infected another person. We're not calling it a pandemic because we're not seeing outside of China a whole lot of cases, but it is an infodemic. And what that means is that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and even politicians are spreading some information that's not necessarily true. And the role of social media, we didn't have that when SARS came about. So again, that's upsetting that's occurring, and we're also seeing stigma and xenophobia against certain ethnic groups. WHO, World Health Organization, has sent an advance team to China, and then they will be allowed into China to offer technical support, the resources that they have. China has not invited our CDC into China, although some of the WHO team are CDC staff. So in the U.S., as of 5:30 this morning, there have been 13 cases. 11 of those are linked to travel. The other 2 were secondary spread. We've had 1 American die, but she died in China, not in the United States. And right now it looks like there are 24 infected Americans aboard that cruise ship in Japan. CDC and other health departments are using planning that's been going on for a long time, particularly since 9/11, to prepare if we start seeing widespread infection. And right now we're doing contact tracing. That is, if someone becomes sick, then the people who have been in close contact with them are monitored. For a while, only CDC could do the testing, but now those testing kits have been approved by FDA, so they're being distributed to state and big city labs. They may not be able to do the testing right away because they have to undergo proficiency testing, but that will happen, and that will speed up testing. We have 11 airports that are screening passengers arriving from China, and passengers from China are being quarantined in 3 locations for 14 days. Now, to put this into perspective, during this flu season, which started October 1st of last year, there's been an estimated 210,000 hospitalizations and 12,000 deaths, including 78 children from influenza. So the World Health Organization has a response strategy. They're monitoring the situation. There are a number of parameters they're looking at, including number of cases and deaths and some other things as well. Their goals are to limit person-to-person transmission, prevent further international spread. They want to identify, isolate, and care for patients early on in the infection, identify and reduce transmission from animal source. Those wet markets have been closed down. Accelerate the development of diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. Communicate critical information and counter misinformation. They've been working with Pinterest to counteract some of the misinformation that's out there, and to minimize social and economic impact on both China and the world. So how do you reduce your and other people's risk? The best thing to do is what your mother told you. Wash your hands with soap and water. Now, most of us don't wash our hands correctly. You have to do it for 20 seconds, which is if you sing happy birthday to yourself twice. And then you have to not touch the faucet that you've turned on the water with your potentially contaminated hand, because you're just contaminating it again. You should use a paper towel. Same with the restroom doorknob. Alcohol-based hand sanitizers are fine if soap and water are not available. And you should clean and disinfect tabletops, things that are touched off, and doorknobs. We all touch our face about 4 times per hour, which is a lot of times during the day. And as I mentioned, that's a good way to spread these respiratory viruses, so try not to do that. Just stay healthy in general. Get enough sleep, good nutrition, reduce stress, and stay away from sick people. If you are sick, it's important to cover your cough or sneeze, either in the crook of your elbow, or use tissue and dispose of it in a lidded receptacle. So don't cough or sneeze on your hand. Stay home if you're sick to not infect other people. Now, I believe the estimate is that 70% of civilian workers, non-governmental, have paid sick leave. So sometimes that's an issue if you're choosing between staying home and a paycheck. There's been a lot of talk about using a mask. There really isn't a lot of evidence that it works, and it may actually do more harm than good. It may give people a false sense of security. If you are touching the mask a lot, you can spread viruses. Usually in medicine, we mask sick people, not well people. And the surgical masks that you can buy don't fit that well. There are N95 masks that do, the 95 comes from, it screens 95% of viruses, but those have to be fitted. And as I said, there just isn't a lot of evidence. CDC is not recommending masking healthy people. You can protect yourself not from the coronavirus, but from flu, which, as you saw in that other statistic, right now is a lot more dangerous by getting your flu shot every year, and supporting public health funding, because these are the people who are out there looking for new infections and doing the work right now. And public health funding has been going down. So what are scientists working on? New diagnostics, the test that we have right now, nucleic acid amplification test, only detects virus. It can't tell people who may have had it and don't have the virus anymore but are immune. So we'd like to know that. There have also been some reports that the test that's out there is missing people, but that's hard to say for sure because we don't have what we call a gold standard. And if somebody comes in and is negative for 2019 novel coronavirus that has the symptoms, it's hard to say whether is the test wrong or do they have flu or something else. Scientists are working on a vaccine. It will be at least a year. As you can imagine, vaccines have to undergo a lot of safety and efficacy testing. And then antivirals. There are some trials that have started in Wuhan of a new antiviral. So we'll see how that works. So the big question, what's going to happen, and, I am not a fortune teller, it's really hard to predict. Is this going to be like flu, where we're just going to see it every year? Or is it going to be like SARS, where it causes a higher percentage of deaths? How effective, it depends really on how effective those quarantine measures are, and we just don't know. The fact that we're not seeing a lot of infections outside China is encouraging, but again, it all depends on who gets tested, and we may be missing some. Concern, right now no cases have been reported from Africa. There's concern if that should happen because the healthcare system there in low-resource countries may not be able to contain an outbreak. In the United States, or other countries as well, if we do see widespread community spread of the virus, public health officials have the authority to institute social distancing. That means closing schools, movie theaters, things like that, where people congregate. And that's really a quick overview of the coronavirus, and I'll take questions after all the speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. We've got some good questions coming in, and we will go now to Constance, Chief Economist at KPMG and the current sitting NABE President. Constance?
Thank you so much. Wow, that was fascinating. I'm going to try to be quick so we can all get to giving Kathy our questions. Okay. Let's see. So we are basically saying that the Fed sort of administered economic flu shots last year, and the question is, will they work or will the economy need more of them in 2020? So when we look at the situation, the global economy was not in a good place for significant demand shock. And as you can see from this table, growth has been slowing in many, many major parts of the global economy. And if we look at what's happening specifically in China, and I believe they have named it now. I think they're now calling it COVID-19. And China faced challenges to its economic growth before the COVID-19 started. So if we look at Chinese imports, which is one of the key metrics we look at since so much Chinese data has question marks around it, we find that this is a fairly reliable indicator of domestic demand. And what we can see is that it's negative year over year at the present time. So we look at this as a pretty good proxy for what's going on in China right now. We also see stress within the manufacturing sector. So even though the government began stimulus measures last year, we really have seen a modest impact. And so we expect that this setback of at least 6 weeks of large parts of the economy being closed down is definitely going to impact manufacturing in January, February, and possibly into March. We also have a significant weakness in China in auto sales, right? They are still in negative territory overall, and consumer auto sales are, as you can see from this graph, passenger cars are still negative, and they make up about 85% of vehicle consumption in China. Commercial vehicles have recovered somewhat, so that stimulus that has gone to corporations has fed through into higher demand for commercial vehicles. Of course, we know that one of the biggest consumers of commercial vehicles is the construction industry. And, of course, there has been overbuilding of construction within China, and it's an area of weakness presently in the economy. And then finally, looking at industrial production, industrial profits face pricing pressure and faced this pricing pressure before COVID-19. So on a smooth basis, profits were down 2.6% in December. And they declined for the month 6.3% from a year ago, which is the biggest decline since 2011. Okay, so with all that information then, what's our analysis roadmap? And I sort of think of it in four main ways, right? How is this going to impact China's GDP, given where it was going into this situation, and given China's own policy response, everything from the way that they are responding on a medical basis to the virus and the way that they're responding on a liquidity basis, which we'll get into later. The central bank has been providing additional liquidity through multiple channels to help ease some of the constraints that have arisen from businesses being closed. And all of this is going to contribute to whether or not it's a V-shaped or a U-shaped recovery. Then we look at China's imports impact. So it's obviously going to continue having a decline in imports. And this has spillovers, of course, into the rest of the world. I should mention that all of these factors interact with one another. And this is spillover in terms of the prices of certain commodities. China is a significant commodity importer. It also impacts industries such as the automobile industry, the fertilizer industry. The Hubei province is a big producer of fertilizers. It impacts travel and leisure, both within China and obviously globally. It impacts electronics and tech, and of course, liquidity and FDI. So that's one of the spillovers to the rest of the world. Then we look at the illness outside of China, which of course so far has been very, very limited. And so it seems that the contagion is not as great globally. And as was previously mentioned, of course, healthcare facilities are significantly more advanced in Western economies, and so treatment methodologies can be implemented not only faster, but I think more effectively. And the biggest impact of the illness outside of China, of course, is tourism. So looking at Wuhan, it is a significant producer of high value-added goods. So if we look at their output as a share of national output, I should have mentioned also the clothing industry. So it produces a large amount of yarn, chemical fertilizers, plain glass, which obviously goes into the motor vehicle industry. They just break it out. And for the purposes of this table, motor vehicles is everything that is not passenger cars, so they're a big producer of vehicles. And then chemical pesticides, soda ash, which again is part of the fertilizer component, and a host of other products. And I think one way to think about this is to compare it to what happened in Japan during the Fukushima earthquake. There was also a flood in Thailand that caused a significant outage for semiconductor supply chains. And so sometimes these types of natural disasters, if they occur in areas that are hubs and that are supply chain hubs, they can have really outsized impacts on the global economy. So while I know everybody is looking back to SARS and saying, what is the economic impact? And I think that's one important way to think about this, thinking about Wuhan and Hubei province in particular with regard to how linked it is to global supply chains is another important component of the analysis. Just looking at Hubei province overall, it's the fourth largest motor vehicle producer in China, so 2.2 million units So again, that auto industry, which was already hampered globally and hampered in China, is going to be impacted, and this will present challenges to the global auto industry in the months to come. The absence of Chinese tourism will be felt globally. So travel comprises 80%, over 80% of China's import of services, and so we're looking at anywhere from $50 to $70 billion off of the global tourism industry in the first quarter of this year. And then, of course, there are halted flight routes to China. Many countries have limited the travel of Chinese citizens to their country. So Hong Kong and Taiwan being two immediate cases in the region. In the United States, if you're a Chinese national, you face quarantine if you come to the U.S., and that's if you can get a flight. Many U.S. carriers have stopped flights to China, same with BA and a number of European carriers, partly because of the fall in demand and also partly because of not wanting to expose workers to the risk of getting ill. So the tourism industry, I think, will be significantly impacted. And then, of course, I love this phrase. There's an infodemic. So we all know from behavioral finance, right, that there can be sort of cognitive dissonance when people see something in the news. So, for example, this one cruise ship that cannot find a port to dock in, I think, contributes to this infodemic, right? I mean, it certainly is one of those things that people hear and, from a confidence perspective, can be very, very impactful. One of the things we're seeing is a decline in oil prices, and this is going to challenge the profitability of some firms. And of course, this depends on where oil prices go going forward, but this loops back into fewer flights and the impact on tourism. So it's not just the demand from inside China, but that also begins to interact with other industries that are impacted. If we look here, lofty oil price forecasts underpin many of the budgets of producer countries. So Saudi Arabia is the largest producer, and its budget projections are for oil prices well above the 80s. Russia, likewise, has projections close to $90 a barrel. So you can see that if we keep oil prices below these levels, a lot of these exporters are going to face challenges within their own domestic budgets. Of course, export-dependent countries are the biggest losers in any trade drought, and we were having a trade drought going into this situation. So when we think of the countries that will be most impacted, Germany and Korea come to mind. And then thinking about China and how it is so different from when the SARS outbreak occurred. Of course, China is now a much greater percentage of the global economy. It's 16% of global GDP compared to 4% when SARS broke out. So the level of integration is just dramatically larger. Now the PBOC is attempting to provide liquidity. There are tiered rates that are going out. So as of the 11th, that's yesterday in China, today in New York, 19 banks had applied for special funds. So the PBOC is providing preferential rates for banks that lend to firms that have asked for special financing or loan extension up to 1 year. And this is really important because at the moment, China's non-financial corporate debt is very high. It's about 145% of GDP, and total non-financial debt, households and corporations, is just over 200% of GDP. Historically, this has been a limit. It's very hard for economies to sustain debt levels over this amount, in part because resources have to be devoted to paying back interest as opposed to productive uses, and you get to a tipping point where that can be very difficult for an economy to sustain any kind of downturn. So one of the reasons that the PCAOB response has been so significant. And they have cut the reserve requirements as well. One thing to note, and we don't have data yet for this year, but the interbank rate was spiking ahead of this, and so there was not as much confidence that the central government would continue to bail out banks. There were bank failures last year, and so the banking system was already facing challenges coming into this situation, and so of course a response that shuts down significant parts of the economy is going to present challenges for the banking sector, and we do expect non-performing loans to rise even with this special funding vehicle. So if we look at the impact on our own forecast for the U.S. economy, and of course Jay is going to go into this in more detail, it's fairly minimal, 40 to 50 basis points off of growth, and that's because we come into this with a very, very strong labor market and steady household consumption. So one of the areas that we think will be impacted is non-residential fixed investments, so corporate investments, and that we have a slight decline in that forecast as a result of confidence with regard to the U.S. economy, which feeds back into investment. So KPMG has written a paper on this. The SEC came out with some guidelines advising SEC-registered companies to make certain disclosures, and so you can go to this link for more details about what companies that are SEC-listed companies need to do in order to get out ahead of this and make the proper disclosures. So with that, I will turn it back over, and we'll hear from Jay.
Okay, thanks, Constance. So what I'm going to focus on in my comments here is, Constance did a really good job of talking about the effects in China and elsewhere in the world. I'm going to drill down a little bit more there into the kind of the effects on the U.S. economy. And essentially we see kind of three channels through which this could affect the U.S. economy. One would be, through exports. If the Chinese economy slows significantly, that's going to hurt U.S. exports. One would be potentially on consumer spending in the United States. And then the final one, which Constance also alluded to earlier, and that's kind of in the supply chain sort of effect. So let's start with the first one. Let's look at, exports. So the blue bars show that back in 2017, we exported about $120 billion to China. Last year, that came in just a little bit north of $100 billion, so it's down 15% from its peak, which kind of shows the effects of the trade war. But $100 billion is still a pretty significant amount. However, keep in mind that in nominal terms, U.S. GDP is $22 trillion or so, and so we're looking at, this is only 0.5% of U.S. GDP, which is referenced there by that line. And these exports aren't very likely going to go to zero. And so that first channel, the effect on exports from the United States, it should be very, very sort of manageable. Now, obviously, if you are an exporter, it may hurt, but in terms of the overall U.S. economy, this particular channel is probably pretty manageable. The second channel is in terms of consumer spending, and here we kind of went back and we looked at SARS and what happened during that period. And I understand, from what Kathy said earlier and Constance, that it's not a great comparison, but it does put some things into perspective. And so, if you look at something that happened, so here we're looking at air transportation or air travel, and if you look at the blue vertical bar, that shows you the SARS period. And so what's interesting here is the growth in air travel certainly weakened during that period of time. There were air restrictions from the United States going into China at that period of time. But that really pales into comparison to that big valley you saw. And that's September 11th right there and the aftermath of that. And so, the point here is, yes, this will affect the air travel industry, at least in the United States, somewhat. but it's probably not going to cause it to completely crater, certainly not like it did back in September 11th. And, air travel as a percent of the overall economy is relatively small. And then when you break it out and you widen the scope and you look at total consumer spending, again, the blue bar, vertical bar here is the SARS period, and what you see is the orange line is the year-over-year growth rate in durable spending, and there's a pretty significant effect going on there. But unfortunately, when SARS was happening, it was also at the same time as the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And so is this real weakness in durable spending? Was that caused by SARS or was it caused by Iraq? It's really hard to parse that thing out. I think if you look broader, though, and if you look at the dark line, that shows you the year-over-year spending and total spending, and that was not even impacted at all. The point here is Americans are pretty resilient when it comes to consumer spending, especially on things like services, which just don't show much effect at all. And so the second channel, in terms of consumer spending, is probably pretty manageable as well, unless this becomes a big epidemic in the United States. If we're talking over the next few months, there's going to be thousands and thousands of deaths in the United States. American consumers clearly could hunker down in that sort of situation. But, so far what, the statistics that Kathy has shared with us would suggest, at least not up to this point, that has happened. And so, at this point, it would look like the effects on consumers directly is probably going to be pretty manageable. And then that leads to the third effect, and that's in terms of supply chains. And Constance mentioned this before. She talked about the Fukushima earthquake. And so we kind of went back and we looked at that period of time. And so as you recall, what happened was there was this big earthquake in Fukushima. It knocked out a nuclear reactor, and so you had these rolling blackouts across Japan, and it really affected motor vehicle parts production. Japan is very important in the supply chain in the auto industry here in the United States. And when you go back and you look at auto production here in the United States, you can see that right after Fukushima happened, auto production in the United States went down 10%. That's a pretty meaningful sort of number. And so what sort of effects could supply chains in China effects have on back here in the United States? What this graph shows you, we're looking at capital goods imports from China. As you can see, pretty sizable. About 25% of all imports, capital goods coming from China, and industrial supplies as well is pretty meaningful as well. And then when you drill down even a little bit further, you say, okay, so what industries could really be impacted by supply chain disruptions coming out of China? What we're looking at here in this graph is to try to get an answer to that. And so if you look at the vertical axis, this is imported inputs coming from China as a percent of total industry inputs. And so if you look at that top bar there, or top dot there, that's for the computer and electronics products industry in the United States. And so what it shows us is about 20% of all the inputs in the computer and electronic products industry comes from China. And then the horizontal axis measures how big that industry is in the United States. So for the computer and electronics products industry, it's about 5% of total U.S. industrial production. So, this is, not only could this industry be affected by a complete shutdown of the supply chain coming out of China, but it's also big enough that it could have an important effect on the United States. Some of these dots, as you'll see, if you look at the far right dot there on the lower right-hand corner, that's the chemical industry, okay? And so that accounts for about 13% of U.S. industrial production. So that's a really big industry, but it has very, very few of its inputs coming from China. So the point here is, at least as it relates to China, the chemical industry wouldn't be that affected by a shutdown coming out of China. Okay, but what happens, just worst case scenario, let's say that one of two things happens. This thing in China really, really gets bad, so not only does it affect supply chains here in the United States, but potentially could affect supply chains in other countries as well. And another really bad effect here would be what happens if this thing really becomes a global pandemic. And we're talking about seeing what we're seeing in China today also happening in, say, Japan and in Germany and places like that. You know, how big of a supply chain impact could that have? And for that, we turn to this chart right here. And what we're seeing, so what we're looking at now is just total imported inputs. And so if you look at, you know, the computer and electronic products industry, over 40% of their inputs are imported. And so if we're talking about this spreading to Germany and Japan and elsewhere, that would have a devastating effect on the computer and electronic products industry. And then also something I'd like to highlight is the transportation equipment industry. So this would include the auto industry as well as the aeronautics industry as well. As you can see, about 30% of their inputs are imported. And that's a pretty big, sizable industry. That accounts for 10% of U.S. industrial production. The U.S. industrial sector is roughly 20% of value added in the United States, so that would be 2% of the overall economy, just the transportation equipment industry. And so now we're starting to get some meaningful numbers, but again, this has to be kind of one of these worst case sort of scenario things. And one other thing to keep in mind here is these supply chain disruptions have to occur for a while for it to have a really meaningful impact. And the reason I say that is what we're looking here is inventory to sales ratios. You know, as you may recall, about a decade or so ago, there was this big push for just-in-time inventory management. And that worked for about a decade or so, but then some purchasing managers started to realize that maybe they were getting things down a little bit too far because of these supply chain sort of issues. And so what you see, if you look at the dark line there, this is the inventory to sales ratio for the entire manufacturing sector. You know, that's up at about a 20-year high right now. So the point here is the manufacturing sector does have some inventories that can help here in this situation. And the same thing for the computer and electronics industry. As you can see, the inventory to sales ratio is relatively high there, although it has come down somewhat over the last few years. And then the final point to make is, again, this chart is kind of replicating the chart that I just showed you before, at least in terms of manufacturing. But when you look at retail inventories, those things are pretty low. And so if the supply chain for the Amazons of the world and the Walmarts and whatever really get disrupted here, you could start to see shelves turning bare at some of those places. So, in conclusion, you know, Constance showed you her forecast for the U.S. economy. We would largely agree with that. We don't think that, at least what we know right now, we wouldn't say this is going to bring the U.S. economy to its knees, but there's also a lot of things that we don't know, which Kathy highlighted earlier, and I think the biggest way that this could potentially affect the U.S. economy would be through the supply chains. So I'm going to end there, and Chris, I guess we'll turn it back over to you or to Jen for any sort of any questions that we're going to address now.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Constance and Jay. And we do have quite a bit of questions here, so I'll just start queuing them up. The first one is for Catherine. China may not be very transparent on infection and death counts. And also they may have had much earlier awareness of the virus. Catherine, what is your perception on this?
You still have Catherine?
She's still on?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Sorry. Yes. There is some evidence that China may have known about cases before they were officially announced at the end of December. And in fact, Dr. Lai, who unfortunately died of the infection, you know, was trying to sound the alarm. It's a culture that shoots the messenger, and because of the bureaucracy, local officials are afraid to say anything. So that very well may be the case. In terms of the deaths, it's hard to say because you'd have, I mean, I'm sure that the deaths there, I'm positive there are more deaths than have been reported. Whether that's due to slowness of reporting deaths or not knowing they were due to coronavirus, because these healthcare facilities are overwhelmed. And so it may be more of a, I won't say incompetence, but overwhelming of the epidemic than actually trying to hide the numbers, because the numbers are out there. I mean, if it's from a political standpoint, if you have 1,000 deaths or 1,500, probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference, right? It may from an epidemiological standpoint, but. So did that help?
Yeah, that's a good point. Do we know if this is the worst flu season that China's ever had, or are there earlier?
So honestly, I'm not sure what's happening in China. I can tell you in the United States, which is probably usually if we're seeing bad flu in one part of the world, we're seeing it around the world. This has not been a particularly bad season in the United States. We know that usually, with some exceptions, it's the young, the very under 5 years old, and the elderly, 65. It kills me to say that, and then people who have comorbid conditions that are more likely to die. This year, we've seen a little bit of increase in children's deaths because of the type of flu that is circulating, but it has not been a particularly bad season. And those 12,000 deaths that I referenced are in the United States. That's not worldwide. There are estimates that up to, it depends on the year, but up to 650,000 people die every year around the world from flu.
Mm-hmm. So this may be for Constance or Jay. What happens to Xi's bargaining power with Trump? And does Xi wearing the mask in his, speeches tell people anything if their masks aren't really effective?
I saw that question.
What is the message there? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know what that message is. I don't know if he knows that they're not effective. I don't know that he cares whether they're not effective. I doubt he's trying to communicate that he has the virus and that he's deploying the most effective use of the mask. But in any case, so I think, and because of time, there were many things I could have said, but of course, our view is that China would have been very challenged to meet the increased demands for imports from the Phase 1 trade deal in any case. And this is a terrible human tragedy, but from a policymaker's perspective, it gives them cover to be able to go back to the U.S. and say, you have to give us a dispensation against these requirements because we can't meet them. Now, they probably wouldn't have met them anyway, so it gives them some air cover. It also gives China air cover to provide different types of assistance to overly indebted companies and to extend maturities that would have been difficult to do had this not occurred.
Yeah, and I'll just add into that. Apparently, there's a clause in the Phase 1 trade deal that says something about the parties could be alleviated from their responsibilities if there's something like a natural disaster or something other legally sort of thing in there. And whether or not this qualifies for a natural disaster or not remains to be seen. I do understand that the Chinese government has asked the administration for some leeway. I'm not exactly sure where they are on that to be relieved of this responsibility, at least in the short term, for buying everything that they said they would buy. And I agree with Constance that that was going to be challenging to begin with. One other thing I'll just note here, this is just from something I heard on NPR the other day, talking about Hong Kong, is that everybody in Hong Kong is wearing a mask. And if you're not wearing a mask, people kind of look at you like you're crazy. And so maybe Xi wearing a mask is just to show solidarity kind of with the people that he understands depends where their plight is and whatnot. But that's just kind of speculation on my part.
Well, this is
it's also an issue of
Kathy. Can I ask Kathy?
Yeah.
So it seemed, what struck me as so unusual is you'll see these people with masks and goggles and everything, and then they don't have gloves on, which seems
well, I was going to say that in the United States, we don't right. But again, if you're wearing gloves and you touch something, a door handle, and then you touch your face, your eyes, you rub your eyes, you're still going to get the virus. That's not going to protect you. In terms of wearing the masks, in China, it's cultural. People wear masks all the time because of the pollution, and it's culturally acceptable to wear them. So I think that's why President Xi also, why he felt it was the right thing to do to wear a mask. In the United States, it's not. We don't really do that. Now, I am in D.C. I'm not home today. I flew a couple days ago, and I saw maybe 2 people who were wearing masks. And again, in the United States, it's right now, we're just, it's not necessary.
Jumping back to the economic impacts, did anyone have a first quarter 2020 forecast for China GDP and global GDP growth? The impacts.
Yeah, so we see a 1 percentage point decline off of first half global GDP, and the big question mark that we just don't know the answer to yet is this going to have a U-shaped rebound or a V-shaped rebound? So very often when you have something like this, you would have a V-shaped recovery. It's unclear, given the complications with regard to supply chain and with regard to China's debt situation, if this will be U-shaped or V-shaped. And then with regard to China's GDP growth, our base assumption is the best likely outcome for them would be to have about a 5.5% GDP growth for all of this year, but it wouldn't surprise us if it is lower than that. Then, of course, the question mark comes around what is going to get reported, and so we will be looking closely at proxies to sort of estimate how that's going to impact the rest of the world economy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, moving on to vaccine development. Catherine, do you see that originating from, one pharmaceutical or many? Do the small pharmaceuticals have an advantage here? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that there will be different groups that are working on it, both pharmaceutical companies and NIH researchers. I'm really not sure whether a small or large pharmaceutical company has an advantage. I will say that vaccine trials are very expensive to run, so maybe you have to be a larger company in order to be able to fund it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. We're still getting questions on oil prices. Do we have a sense of when that shock might dissipate and other commodity impacts?
So, Jay, you may want to say something about this as well, but I think it's a big unknown, right? It just depends. There are reports that say that this has not yet peaked, and then there is a change in the way China itself is reporting its numbers. So now it is no longer reporting people who test positive but are asymptomatic as having the virus. So it's going to make understanding the progression of the illness difficult. I think she has walked back from the methodology of closing down parts of the economy, and so they're going to reopen things. That may work out well if the virus has peaked, but since many experts think that it hasn't, that could have ripple effects. So I'm sorry that we don't have as much information as we would like, but it becomes difficult. And I think that you know, it all stems from this issue around reporting, and if that's not accurate, I think that's going to lead to uncertainty in financial markets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would, the way I would think about it would be, global GDP growth this year is probably going to be 3%, maybe even a little bit less. And so I would think everything else equal, that's going to keep, if you start with oil prices, that's going to keep oil prices down at the bottom of a, you know, $45 to $65, say, trading range. You know, the way things go even lower than that is if you have extreme weakness around the world. We're not expecting that, but, you know, who knows? We'll see how bad this thing gets. And, you know, China may bounce back from this, but, you know, in general, they're still going to grow at a relatively slow rate. And so I just think whether you're looking at oil prices or whether you're looking at commodity prices more general, if the global economy is going to grow, you know, in purchasing power parity terms, 3% or even a little bit less, that is a relatively weak demand backdrop, and I wouldn't think that's very supportive of higher commodity prices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, we're at time, and I just want to thank all the panelists for your expertise and perspectives, and I will turn it back over to Chris.
Great, thank you. I want to thank everyone for joining today. Today's program is copyright 2020 by the National Association for Business Economics with all rights reserved. This does conclude the event. Thank you. You may now disconnect.